Good evening. I am so excited to be here for various reasons, and my last layer of excitement is to be in this building, in this room, but with Hogarth Prince. And I have to admit, this is an extraordinary coincidence, and I'm actually going to refer to Hogarth Prince in my talk. But I will take that bit out and just talk about, I have to talk about the phenomenology of this. The being in this room, the experience of this room is very exciting, and I'm also terribly grateful to Dominic and to Marie-Louisa and their colleagues here at the Institute of Advanced Study for having me come and be part of what looks like a fantastic series. And as you say, if the rest are being podcast, I'm very happy because I would have happily flown down for each one. And so thank you very much for having me this evening. What I'd like to do is to talk, I'm really talking about materiality, I think, more than anything else tonight. And I apologize for doing this in a slightly disjointed way, because what I'm trying to do is weave together deep materiality, deep time materiality, early modern materiality, and here we are today working, thinking about objects and how they pertain to the transmission of knowledge, really. And so, in a way, I'm delighted to be here at Göttingen in particular, because Göttingen plays such a key role now in these conversations across European university museum networks through Universeum, which most of you will know, really deals with the totality of the European academic heritage, through the U4 network, obviously with Ghent and Groningen and Uppsala, and also through UMAC ICOM. So I look at you and I think I'm full of admiration, because so many of the initiatives that have been started in very recent years are due to your efforts and your energy. It also is a way of echoing other strategic alliances across the United Kingdom. In particular, of course, we have a university museums group. I tend to think of it as rather a talking shop, and it has only really recently become much more of an activist organization, and Scotland has its own UMIS, which folds into that. So there are a number of strategic alliances across Europe now. This is something I really want to talk about, is notwithstanding the current economic and political climate across Europe, as you well know, with different levels of funding in different countries, which is causing divisiveness, with student and faculty unrest, which is not being reported in the press to the extent that it does exist. If any of you follow Facebook and you're on political pages on Facebook, you will realize just how bad the situation is. And the uncertainty, speaking as a Europeanist, someone who's grown up, completely dedicated to the cause, the uncertainty about European federalism is at the back of my mind when I think of how we're trying to create networks. And that brings me to the thought that tonight, when I'm talking to you about one specific issue, if you want to call it that, I see it very much more in the light of what Zygmunt Bauman would call an expedient network. And he used the metaphor of a bee swarm, which I love. Is the idea that bees would get together and swarm for one particular purpose. They'd achieve that purpose, and then they would disband. And expedient networks are everywhere around us. Our children use them, our students use them, we use them. And I'm hoping that the expediency of them is durable in many cases. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that with the idea of developing objects and materiality as a foundation for university heritage, but not only heritage, but for university teaching, that we have something slightly more than just an expedient network. I use that term, therefore, in a particular sense. What I'm trying to share with you tonight is the idea of rethinking collections as being important across the entire spectrum of university teaching. And by this I mean, I'm an archaeologist. I would teach archaeology to my students with archaeological artifacts. What I've been learning in the last year is to take those same artifacts, extract from them information, knowledge, and so on through close observation, through work with them, and let them speak to other topics. And I'm going to give you some examples later in this talk about how this works and how this methodology is evolving, because we're very fortunate to have the funding to experiment. So this is what I want to share. Historic material culture that's captured in museum collections, therefore, for me, is a fundamental part of university heritage. And this is the message that I really want to talk about today. It's interesting because really we often deny the fact that objects are part of our historic and intellectual capital, and yet books are objects. It's one of those curious positions where we've made these artificial divides, and I'm going to allude to that in a minute. But I do think that, very simplified, and I'm not defining text and I'm not defining object, but the idea of these two things working together to enrich the education that we offer and to enrich our own lived experience is absolutely part of our mainstream university life. So before I talk about the Oxford case study, let me share with you, I want to take you back in deep time. This is my deep time moment. As an archaeologist who also teaches anthropology, I work a lot with Native Americans. And one of the most profound lessons I've learned from them is the idea that knowledge is transmitted through an embodied experience of marking and measuring and telling, I suppose is a way you could say. And what I wanted to do was share an engagement with objects, an engagement with knowledge that is embodied and is, I think, both very new, very post-millennial, and Bard is a classic example of post-millennial material turn, but we'll go there in a minute, but also this very deep time sense of the human experience. This is a screen grab from the Smithsonian Institution. And what it shows is knowledge keepers, individuals, who in the early 20th century were recorded, their information was recorded, their information was of their own society on a yearly basis, and their concept of year, of course, is very different from ours. It ran from the first snowfall to the first snowfall. And within that year, an event, a marking event, created for them a mnemonic. And that mnemonic, for them, triggered the memory of that entire cycle. And what you had were material objects, for example, skins or sticks or some form of surface where these pictographs were recorded for the individual keeper of knowledge to recite the knowledge and to transmit it. So the knowledge effectively was transmitted through something both immaterial and material at the same time. And what fascinates me about this in particular is the idea that a mnemonic could produce durability. And what we also find is that this knowledge is bound up with their social and material world. And the keeper, and there were many keepers, so you can see simultaneously the knowledge was both too complex and too important to entrust to a single individual. It was shared. So that when, for example, the continent was colonized by European settlers, and the settlers introduced new European diseases that caused up to 80 or 90% mortality rates in certain tribes, the loss of knowledge was tremendous, because if you removed 5, 6, 7 people out of 8 or 9 keepers of knowledge, you could not recover that knowledge for ceremony, for ritual, for transmission to younger generations. So what I like about this example is its tangibility. It's got texture to it. And it's something that, in a sense, I've been trying to capture in the kinds of teaching we've been doing. But I'll go back to that in a minute. I apologize for the quality of this slide. We often say in Europe that our scholarship is bound up in books. And I know at Oxford, I'm constantly hearing people say, well, we have 800 years of text-based knowledge. And this is the kind of example that's often used in textbooks and in illustrations about the kind of transmission of knowledge that we assume to have been our heritage. But in fact, underneath the surface of that is an equally rich mnemonic universe, an equally rich universe of oral history, an equally rich universe of embodied transmission. So what you have, for example, here in La Mano di Guido, you have the opportunity to see through a diagram of the hand the entire training, musical training of a monk. And imagine learning your musical education through the metaphor of the hand, or indeed just the mnemonic of the hand. This is one of thousands of examples, as you all know, with medieval illustrated manuscripts, the number of animals in the margins that were actually just memory devices for people to remember, oh yes, that's the page with the dragon. If I go back, that will trigger my memory of that entire passage from the Gospel of St. John. Likewise, most Islamic medieval illuminated manuscripts also have mnemonics. Texts were rich with these memory devices. What's interesting, however, is that we think of the early modern world as being the moment when we, as Westerners, dropped ancient traditional methods of teaching and learning. But in fact, the material world became even more essential to the creation and transmission of knowledge in the pre-Enlightenment 17th century, when you have such philosophers as Francis Bacon, who, with his experimental philosophy, advocated, what did he advocate? He advocated empirical observation, embodied testing. You could lick something, you could scratch it, you could pick it up. This handling and experiencing of objects was a way to build knowledge, was a way to create information about the natural world. So the scientific revolution that Bacon typifies reintroduced, in a way, this very specific approach to knowledge creation. It wasn't just transmission. It was the idea that we could actually, because of, as we know, with all the New World exploration, with all the exploration that was going on in the late Renaissance and in the early 17th century, new information, new things were coming in that had to be classified and understood. The taxonomies that were created as a result of direct experience. They were, well, as an anthropologist, I would call a folk taxonomy, a personal taxonomy. I could create my own knowledge by, by engaging with these objects. So really, between this early 17th century phenomenon of engaging with objects through empirical observation and the early 20th century, there was quite a lot of work being done teaching through objects. It was really only in the early 20th century that there was a rift, a division. And the early 20th century, of course, as we know, was a division between the material existence and the intellectual existence. You have your Kulturwissenschaft, you have the Annales school in France in the 20s, that divided these two schools, in a way, between the, as it were, the intellectual and the material. And I'm being very simplistic, and I apologize, because I'm trying to get to somewhere with this. But with the artificial segregation of the material world from the mainstream of intellectual thought, we were kind of, I see it very much as a dead end. And it's really only in the last 10 or 15 years that there's been this change, I think, in scholarly focus. This is not an original thought of mine, but I observe it, marked by what many people in the English term would be the material turn. We've had the linguistic turn, we've had other turns. It seems to be the turn of material. And this is why I find myself here being able to say, if there is a new and deep attention being paid to materiality, then this is going to open up new questions, new issues, new ways of looking at things, new approaches and really just new approaches to address issues that we've had all along. Instead of having a dead end, we may be able to forge new ways forward. And I think this is the underlying value of, first of all, this material turn, which we all have to jump on because it's quite convenient, but more importantly, really rethinking how we approach objects as encoded knowledge. And I'm going to be giving you some examples in a minute. I keep looking at these hogarths, wanting to talk about them. So what I'm going to do, just very briefly, I'm just going to talk about the situation in the UK and specifically in England, and why I find myself in the position that I'm in now, which is quite ironic. And that really has a lot to do with the fact that interdisciplinarity is now being promoted because of the English university funding model, which is very different from the European one, as you all know. Very contrary to the European model, where, as you know, you have government support and education is largely open to all and it's free. The hybrid that's been created, or that's now in the process of change, but the hybrid that was in England was based on government support, but gradually has been introducing the concept of fees, of students having to pay for their education. And you know that this comes from an American model, a transactional model. It's a business model. And the minute when you introduce the monetization of education, you know that there's inevitably going to be a series of reassessments along the way as to the impact of that. Everything has been monetized. The Queen is monetized. If she pays, once she was evaluated for taxes, she becomes normal. She becomes one of us. So the idea of monetizing something embeds it in a flow that actually has an impact on how you perceive it. So in the UK, student loans were introduced in 1989. University fees were introduced in the late 1990s. In 2004, they were set at the equivalent of about €3,500 a year. And for, I think it's 2012, yeah, €11,000 a year for 3 years. Now, I won't go into the complexity of the loans because you can obtain a government loan, but what you see here is that there's a price tag being put on the education per annum. There is a model that's being copied, and this is going to radically change the conversation about value. And there's plenty of hard evidence from the US that shows that the value of a university education is such that it brings lifetime benefits. I won't dispute that and I won't discuss it now. But the introduction of fees has effectively turned the university sector into a marketplace. And as a result, what I see in the UK now, interestingly, is change in language. Change in language where institutions advertise their goods in the marketplace, their services to consumers, and in turn, by participating in a market economy, English universities are now subject to being measured and compared and evaluated, both by the government and by donors. So, paying a great deal of money for something creates expectations. Good universities have always been concerned about delivering good education and research. We're at Göttingen. Oxford is the same way. But it was always primarily in response to their own internal standards, their own internal aspirations. What external expectations create is the pressure to define and defend that excellence, to quantify it, to compare it, and finally to sell it. So, have expectations been created at Oxford over and above the traditional expectations of excellence and leadership? Well, yes. I'm not qualified to talk about them, but I can offer you material that is in the public domain because I want to comment on this in response to what we're doing. Oxford faculty today are much more aware of and focused on what the two buzzwords are, impact and benefits. I hear this at almost every meeting I go to. What's the impact? What are the benefits? They're a mantra. The emphasis, therefore, is just as much outward-facing as it is inward-facing. It's very difficult to change a culture. Many Oxford faculty will say, but I've always given benefits and I've always had impact and we've always had fantastic impact, which they have. They wouldn't be where they are today if they didn't. But now there's talk about enrichment of the student experience, of exposing the students to a wide array of stimuli, of different ways of learning, of giving them life skills. And in other words, what they're trying to do is build on what's already there, but repackage it in such a way that it can be quantified or measured or explained. And in the search for increased impact and benefits, a number of networks have been established at Oxford to foster interdisciplinary links. And interdisciplinarity is seen as a way, boom, of creating benefits, of creating impact, of enriching both student and faculty lives. And they're not wrong. Note the word consumer. A good student is not simply a consumer of other people's knowledge, but will actively draw on all the resources. So here we are saying a student is not just here to read one subject, but is here to draw from the asset to enrich themselves. And at Oxford, one of two priorities, the second priority, is about interdisciplinarity, to build on what is already there, but to enrich. So, I'm sorry I gave you all this boring background, but now, if I may, I'm going to take you to my place of work, the Ashmolean Museum. Most of you will know this museum. I won't go into all the detail, but you will appreciate that this museum, which was, as it were, is now an aggregate of a number of important historic collections in an environment at Oxford that already has other collections-based institutions of equal international importance, is sitting now both in its modern guise in the back and, of course, in its traditional guise in its facade. I'm going to talk more about the center, the modern bit, because this is where the core of our work is, and I'll explain that. The modern part of the Ashmolean was redeveloped and opened in late 2009. It's transformed the museum from being a gallery to being a place with a very strong didactic purpose. And it has a very strong public identity, but I only see it through the eyes of the university, and it's a teaching environment par excellence. Its galleries are thematic. The new galleries are thematic. And what I mean by this is the overarching theme of the museum now is crossing cultures, crossing time. And the idea behind that is that the collections are products of connections between past cultures. They're not discrete units. So there is not a room that's just Greek ceramics or Indian sculpture. The way the museum has been designed, if I can go back, is to show, and the galleries are permeable. You can see through and into different cultures in different periods. And the idea is to foster the thought that not only are we having a conversation across cultures and across time, but that we are reflecting the reality of the past as well. That the museum makes it visually easier to link cultures, to understand how people encountered each other in the past and influenced each other in the past. And there's a particular, can anyone tell me what this is? What would you say this was, the statue? Just take a guess. It's a Buddha. Yeah, it's a Buddha. But what's it wearing? What's it wearing? Can you guess? It's a toga. Now, this is from Gandhara, which is a region now Pakistan, Afghanistan, 1st century, 2nd century AD, right at the easternmost limits of the Roman Empire, and at the same time at the crossroads of a number of different cultures. The Gandhara Buddha physically, this is what I love about this museum, physically sits in a corner like this. It can be seen from the Chinese gallery as a focal point, and it can be seen from the Roman gallery as another focal point, so that you're drawn to this object as a key object in crossing cultures, crossing time. You can't imagine how exciting it is to take students around this floor and have them embody, just pick up embodied knowledge about crossing cultures, about what it means to have permeability of cultures. Now, as a result, when the museum reopened in 2009, clearly one of the first things that some of the curators wanted to do was experiment with cross-disciplinary teaching. And they did this, and afterwards applied to the Mellon Foundation, were successful in gaining funds to do this on a more systematic basis. So what happened is, we're very fortunate. I feel very fortunate because I have at my disposal the tools with which to experiment and share. Once we begin to develop, which we've now done, now that we've begun to develop some methodologies and have some experience under our belt after our first year, to be able to say, here are some thoughts about how we're working on this. Every university is different, every set of collections is different, but what are the underlying principles that we can share? And in our first year, we were able to bring in over 1,000 students from all different departments. This wasn't archaeology, this was not art history. These were students from business school, from the law school, from earth sciences, from psychiatry, you name it, from Anglo-Saxon literature. And I'm going to explain to you in a minute how we conceived of these courses. It's very simple. It's things that people are doing all the time. It's just that we're making them a little bit more systematic. So let me give you an example. A colleague of mine who specializes mostly in Renaissance sculpture, but also does drawings, brought together psychiatry consultants and their students. He was complaining that the students were not sensitive enough to some of the physical manifestations, some of the physical characteristics of anger when you have a patient coming in who's angry. So Jim, very sensibly, pulled together a whole series of prints and drawings depicting emotion and had students diagnose. Ooh, look, pupil dilation. Ooh, look, muscles are clenching. It was fascinating. I wasn't party to this, but I heard about it afterwards from the students. The idea for the students, radical idea, that you would sit down with a piece of art and find that it actually related to your topic. That you were able to say, do you know, I was looking at a Michelangelo drawing yesterday in the print room, and I learned a lot about managing anger and how it's going to fit into my psychiatry course. It was, I think, an inspired move on the part of my colleague, and he's been doing many others along this line as well. Now, I'm preparing for the English faculty. The English faculty would be the equivalent of your German literature faculty. For the English faculty, I'm working on an entire 18th century teaching module. And I'm very excited about this because one of the things that I want to do is to develop themes to teach with. So interestingly, why I got excited about being in this room is one of the themes I'm working on is satire and the development of satire, which is Hogarth. And I'm bringing, oddly enough, this is on my list next week. Smaller. To talk with the students about the symbolism, the rich amount of detail that you can pick out of an engraving when you see it in the original. Not in a print, not in a book, but when you sit down with these and you engage deeply with them, and I've had students spend an hour in front of one of these prints, and every 2 or 3 minutes they go, oh, look, I hadn't even noticed that. And what they're picking up are clues about what the author, what the artist intended to communicate about the moral issues of the time and the moral bankruptcy of the situation in this series of, I think, this is not Mariage à la Mode. But the distressed poet, anyway, is part of, they're all parts of series. But what's fascinating to me is the fact that each one of them tells its own story that then links to much broader themes in the 18th century about identity and about the binary issues of men and women, of domestic space, public space, of morality, of immorality, and so on. And so what I've done here, for example, is one of the other themes I'm working on at the moment, which is the idea of polite society and how polite society became more and more ritualized in domestic space, for example, through the consumption of different products. So that women were associated with tea. Tea was a valued item. It was kept in containers, very valuable containers. Men were usually associated with coffee. They went outside the house to coffee houses and explored social topics outside the home. But where you get the interaction is, if you'll notice behind the screen, there's a couple of men listening to these conversations that are taking place in the domestic interior. And so students begin to look at gender not as something that's rigid necessarily, but as something that people are listening to or participating in or want to be, that is permeable. Let's just say it's permeable. People want to listen and partake in the different conversations that are going on in different levels. And one of the interesting things for me is being able to sit around a table with students and hand them a silver tea canister and hand them a jug, and they can relate to the objects on the table. They can relate to the objects that are in the little cupboard on the right. They can understand what it meant to be the lady of the house handling a very valued thing which contained an even more valuable consumer product inside. And so on. And I can go on and on about this, but you can see that it's not about me teaching about silver. I'm not a silver expert. I have to learn about silver before I can teach with it. But it is about properly contextualizing the objects so that they speak to the topic and they give a material dimension to the topic that the students are studying. The students are reading novels. They could go home very easily having read lots of novels, the way you'd read Goethe, you know, the 18th century. You'd read something and then you go home. But to put that social situation into a material context is a very powerful gift to a student. Another project that I'm working on right now with 5 students is engaging with the 17th century. This is a portrait of the founder of the Ashmolean Museum, Elias Ashmole. The portrait is second-rate, probably third-rate. The frame was made by Grinling Gibbons, who is a very famous sculptor, master carver of the late 17th and early 18th century. Grinling Gibbons, to have a frame by Grinling Gibbons was a statement in itself. But the frame has never been examined. Ever since it was first hung in the first Ashmolean Museum in 1683, it's fallen apart. It was gilded sometime in the 19th century. And the only examples you see in books are of the portrait and not the frame. So we've reversed the interest here. We've taken the portrait out, and we've given the students the opportunity to work in the conservation labs to strip off the gilt and to do close forensic examination of the detail. What's really interesting is Grinling Gibbons, master carver, would put flowers, fruit, birds, everything on his frames. What we discovered, though, or what the students have been discovering, I have an ethnobotanist, I have an archaeologist, and I have 3 history of art students working on this. Together, they've been looking at this frame and saying, but surely there has to be some connection here, historic connection to the person in the frame. And they're right. Elias Ashmole inherited the founding collection of the university from the Tredescants, early 17th century cabinet of curiosities. Their botanic specimens are reflected in this frame. They're the products of exploration that is specific to them. This is our hypothesis anyway. So what the students are beginning to do is create a research project around this so that they are working physically with the frame in conservation, but they're working intellectually with the products of this frame. And what we're going to do in around Easter of next year is we're going to display the frame, just the frame, in a case with the panels of information that are generated by the students on their own original research, which I think is terribly exciting. So it's not just us doing this. If we reverse the text-object story, the Bodleian Library has been mounting small display cases for a long time now of books and associated objects, but they're approaching it from the author's point of view. And they're saying, here's a book, and one of these, I don't know if it's in this one, it's in the frame just around the corner. There was T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and next to it was the bill for the repair of the motorcycle that he was on when he crashed and died. So you have these powerful objects that are mnemonics that trigger a whole sequence of thoughts, of memories of reading his book, Peter O'Toole in the film, you know. I mean, there's all sorts of wonderful things that are generated, a whole rich series of associations. So what I'd like to do now, if I may, having given you some examples and given you the background, is just wrap up with you some of the challenges that I think that we are facing and finish on a rather somber note, I might say. So as you can see, I feel that making objects a part of the mainstream is probably our main objective. This is what we're working towards. Talking about their place, and not only in heritage, and I know we've talked about this, Marie-Louise, it's the idea it's not just heritage. Heritage has not been defined well enough for us to want to hook into that. I think we have to go back to basics and really define our frameworks a lot more robustly. But yes, this is one of our challenges, and with it, of course, to make us appear more part of the mainstream is to bring texts into the museum. And by this I mean, for example, I've been working with the Bodleian Library to develop, I'll say an entente cordiale because there's no other word, a memorandum of agreement where we can borrow manuscripts for them without having to fill in lots of forms and have to pay insurance, so that we have a flow of they can borrow our objects, we can borrow their texts. We start building conversations at a much more informal level so that the connections between the two are not always formalized and therefore a bit thinner. The richness comes from the informality of that experience and bringing the students in to be able to go to the special collections at the Bodleian and go through the volumes and go, ooh, this one will work with that object, and so on. So it's accessibility. Our job, as I see it, is to create teaching methodologies. I feel that one of the problems that we're encountering is there's a lack of robustness and a lack of definition of terms, almost, of how we go about our business. What does it mean to do cross-disciplinary teaching? What is interdisciplinarity? What is this material turn? Time to really sit down and build a common platform, some common language. And without that, I don't think we really are able to defend and define what it is we do. I think there is a tendency in my field to assume that we all know what we're talking about. So what do our objects mean? How do we let our objects speak? One of the ways to do this is to continue to work thematically, to address the topics that are being taught at the university. One of the things that one of my colleagues is doing constantly is working with the business school, bringing executives in, not just students, executives in, who are studying innovation and leadership. the objects in the museum, think of how many objects you could find that speak to leadership. Emperors on coins, statues, all kinds of things. The innovation in leadership is not something that is of this century. This has deep time. So communicating these themes in a very replicatable, robust, defensible way is actually crucial to what it is we do. And then, unfortunately, because we are operating in a market, is to start explaining the impact and the benefits. And this is the holy grail. This is the difficult one, because there's an awful lot of qualitative research. Quotes. My students were very happy. The professor was very happy. Everyone had a lovely time. But at the end of the day, if we don't start building quantitative, slightly more framed experiments around the act of observation and the outcomes of observation, the outcome of engagement with objects, I'm not convinced that we can really demonstrate the impact. I think we can talk about it, I think we can be enthusiastic about it, but I do think we need some underpinnings. And this, in the American community in particular, has begun to engage certain minds. We've been talking about this. It's a very, very difficult thing to do because of the nature of experimental psychology, for one, which is very disaggregated. It's pieces. And as you all know with experimental psychologists, they like to take a very small idea and test it. And then it's the aggregate of the ideas in the end that will produce information. But it's our job to start guiding some of those experiments so that we create an aggregate that works for us. I really quite seriously believe that now. Now, this is my somber last point, which is I'm particularly concerned for those of you who have children or have students or are involved in the digital world yourself. When you're teaching digital natives, young people who've grown up entirely informed by the digital world, one of the most important responsibilities I think we have is to educate students to know the value of the digital, when to use the digital, and when to go back to the real. And these two worlds they're permeable, they work together, but the opportunity to work with museum collections, the opportunity to work with real objects, is also an opportunity to explain the differences between what happens when you engage with an object in real, and you feel it, and you test it against you, and you look at the human scale of it, and you can feel the surface texture of it. You make a different set of decisions about it and a different set of interpretations about it than if you see it on the screen. And I've been commissioning some experimental psychologists to look at the pathways of decision-making that happen when you see two objects side by side. One is real, and the other is replica in digital. What are the interpretations that are being made? What do you think it is? How do you think it works if you encounter it in these different states? And they come out very, very differently. And for a student to know that they are different is part of the battle. Because at the end of the day, if you continue to mediate your experiences through the digital, could it be that you impoverish your own experience of your life? Now, I'm being hyper-dramatic here, but it's very clear to me when I look at my kids, sometimes it's more real to see something as an image on the screen than it is to have experienced it. And this is of some concern, both for us and the longevity of our collections, because we may be failing in explaining what their power is, but it also concerns me more generally. And when you get to the stage that people don't really want to experience the real, then this is the moment where the material turn perhaps has a chance. Thank you. I don't know if we did it. Yeah.